Thank you, Lucy. Hi, everyone. I am Sebastiano. I am not a Googler. I am the only one here that isn't. I work for JetBrains, and I'm a Google developers expert on Android. Now, folks, why don't you start by introducing yourselves?
Hi, I'm Chris Baines. I'm an engineer on the Android Developer Relations team, focusing on most things UI.
Hello, my name is Nick Butcher, and I do the same thing.
Hi, I'm Florina Muntenescu. I'm also an engineer part of developer relations, and I focus on Kotlin and architecture components.
Hi, I'm Manuel Vivo, and also part of the same team, the Android Developer Relations team. And yeah, you can ask questions about coroutines, heal dependency injection, compose, all the things you want.
Hello, I'm Jose, a developer relations engineer as well, focusing on testing and compose.
Hey, my name is Sergey. I work on Android libraries in Toolkit team, and actually recently I started to work more with tooling team, so I know something about Android Studio as well.
Hi, I'm Clara. I'm one of the engineering managers and TLs in the Toolkit team. I mostly focus on compose.
Hey, I'm Nick Rout. I'm a developer relations engineer focusing on material design on Android.
Okay, thank you. So as you have seen, we have pretty much all of Jetpack covered here. So please do ask your questions. We have a couple of questions that people have asked in the past few days on Twitter, but please do head to the Slido link for the green channel and ask your questions there so we can have them answered for you. The first question that we're going to go for is when will Jetpack Compose provide a bill of material for dependencies or any Jetpack library? So, Chris?
I'll take this one. Yeah, so I didn't know the answer to this. So I went to the from the Jetpack core team to ask them. So they are planning on looking at it sometime next year, but there's no kind of guarantee whether this is actually we're actually going to publish one. But it's something they're going to investigate. So stay tuned.
Cool. That was an easy one. Thank you, Chris. Next up, is there any plan to integrate Compose views with Remote View API? As far as I know, currently we cannot leverage composing us for widget and notification views. Clara?
I'll take this one. So yeah, right now we're very, very focused on getting our first 1.0 out. So our main focus is just app UI, everything that you've seen. It's not out of the question that we could look at things like this in the future. We do want to make Compose the way you build UI on Android. We did have a hackathon like more than a year ago where we tried this, and it is possible. So if you think of Compose, there's at least two big pieces to Compose. One is the runtime that just generates trees and diffs them, and the other one is the libraries we built for app development and app UI. We can actually use the engine to generate any other kind of tree. Like right now we're generating views trees and render nodes, but we could be generating remote views. It's just something that needs work, and it's not our current focus, but we should look at in the future.
Thank you. We have the first two questions appearing on Slido. The first one from Zlatin is, regarding Jetpack security, do we expect a stable release of the library, or will it be merged with the data store encryption that Florina mentioned? Who wants to take this?
I can try to take this because I don't think we have anyone that's an expert in the security library here. But from what I know from working with data store, these two libraries are completely separate. So the encryption library doesn't really have anything to do with data store. If data store will use encryption under the hood, that's going to be something that the data store engineers will decide on later on. But I wouldn't think about encryption depending on data store or security, sorry, Jetpack security depending on data store.
Okay, cool. Next up is from Petar. In the future, will Compose completely replace the old approach with XMLs? And I expect that means the Vue framework.
I can give a first stab if you want. There's many things that are in XML at the moment. The first one that Compose is obviously replacing is layout XMLs. We have been looking at everything else. So for example, we're unsure about string resources just out of like the localization that comes out of having a bunch of string XML files is something very powerful that we're not planning on replacing at the moment. Things like colors, yes, you could just write them in Kotlin. and therefore get rid of the XML. The other thing to bear in mind is we expect the next few years to be a lot of interop and a lot of apps that have both. And as long as you have both, you will have to have the XML, because you can't have compose be the source of truth for certain things, because then you won't be able to use those values in your XMLs. So there's an interop story here that is kind of tricky, and we're working through it. And if Chris wants to add something, maybe you've looked into some of this. You're muted.
I did press the button, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So yeah, regarding themes, so that is something that obviously you can set in Compose, but most apps are going to have their existing theme structure, and they're usually huge and been built up over years. So we've also published a library on Material. It's called the Material Compose Theme Adapter, which allows you to reuse your MDC themes within Compose. So it means you have one source of truth, which helps at least with the theming side of stuff. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
Yeah, I will add quickly. So like from framework perspective, like because the system itself doesn't have anything doesn't know anything about Compose. So Compose is a library, right? So on a very low system level, we still need the views. So like in this from this perspective, views will stay at least some level forever, even if in 30 years away, like liner layout will be gone. Some small part of the view will be still there just because we need this integration with framework itself.
Thank you, everyone. There's one from Nino, which is, will Jetpack Compose soon replace the code labs presented in the Android study jams?
I can take this one. So not soon, because I think the study jams are using the training content that we have on developers.android.com. And the training content is always focused on the best practices. So because Compose is not stable yet, we won't probably be seeing that kind of content there until 1.0. That said, we have a number of code labs, 5 currently, that you can follow at any time. And they're very good, and we update them every 2 weeks. So please use them, because they are probably the only up-to-date content right now.
Cool. Let's see, there's a question that was climbing quite quickly. The ranking is, what's going to be the deal with live data in the next few months?
Yeah, I can take this one. So live data, it is not deprecated. It will not be deprecated. And so we know that a bunch of apps, a very huge percentage of applications are using live data. It's true now that with coroutines and flow, there is new alternatives that you can consider, but it's obviously up to you and whether you want to use one or the other. So what we know is that we want to have state flow, for example, up to what's currently available in live data. For example, we are working on bringing support to state flow in data binding, and we are thinking about other APIs to make flow consumption easier from the view layer in Android, apart from the Compose methods, the integrations that we have at the moment. So if you are happy with your current live data setup, keep using it. But if you want other alternatives, you can use any of them. But yeah, it will not be deprecated anytime soon. I mean, the foreseeable future.
Cool. Next up, we have this question. Will RxJava be added in Android Jetpack, or are coroutines the answer for reactive UI? Who wants to take this? Go for it.
I guess. I'm not sure what they mean by added, but we add the integrations with RxJava for quite a lot of our modules. For example, Live Data has integration, like Compose has integration with Rx. Work Manager has integration with RxJava 2, RxJava 3. So we always try to have integrations with RxJava. However, it will be always integration, but it's not the thing that drives the library internally. So going forward, Compose itself, for example, it uses coroutines inside of it. So so inside of the libraries, yeah, for Kotlin, coroutines is the answer for multi-threading. So our libraries internally will use it. However, we will provide integrations with RxJava and so on. So if you want to keep using RxJava, you will be able to do that in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I can also add to this. We actually recently made coroutines our recommended way to do background work on Android. So not just for our internal library development, but that's what we recommend the community to use.
Great. Next up, going back to Compose. For new Android devs, is it a good idea to start learning Compose and go in deep with it? Or is it too early and it's better to stay on the XML way for now? Who wants to take this?
I can take a stab at it. I'm sure other people will have an opinion here as well. But I think we've been quite clear that Compose is the future. So, you know, if you're just getting started now and you've got, you know, hoping to be developing Android apps for some time, then Compose will be a good investment because that's going to give you the longest payoff, I believe. As we caveat that, as we said, you know, it's still in alpha. We're not recommending it everywhere just yet. So it kind of depends on your timeline. If you're like trying to ship something in the next couple of months or something like that, then, you know, you're going to have to use the view world, would recommend. But for the longest term investment, like, we can't be any clearer that Compose is the future, and that kind of writing views or learning views now is almost investing in tech debt to some extent. So yeah, I recommend starting to take a look at Compose for the longer term bet.
I'd add to that, though, it depends on what you're learning for. Like, if you're going to work in an established app, like, views are not going to go away immediately, and there will be work that you will have to do and understand the view system for a while, right?
Yeah, the other thing I'd say is that I've been converting one of my apps to Compose for the past year or so, and I think my overall impression is that Compose really does help accelerate UI development. I don't think there's any question of that when you actually start using it. But there's also questions around things like how will it affect APK size, because you're having to bring in things like an entire UI toolkit into your APK, but also like development, how quick build speed is, and all that kind of stuff. And so that's something I've been looking at over the past week or so. And I've actually got a blog post which I've been writing like this week, which will be going out next week or two. So I mean, the goal is that it actually doesn't have that much of an effect on APK size. So that's the TLDR of this. But yeah, check that out when I've actually published it next week. But so yeah.
Cool.
Anyone else jump in?
No? Good. So the next up would be, is there any hope that Jetpack Compose will manage to achieve something similar to Flutter stateful hot reload in terms of performances, and that means sub-second reloads?
So I'll take this one. So it's a bit harder question on the technological side. Our team works very hard to make this true. So like it's a focus for Android Studio team. So it will be very, very close. The pipelines, however, like are very different for the Flutter and Compose. So like it's a bit unfair because like you have to compile code, and it's a very, very hard thing to do. So he did like quite a lot of changes. The compilation itself takes a lot of time, and you can't go away from it. However, like the whole pipeline, Gradle team works, and the Gradle team works to make Gradle fast to compile things quickly. On the Gradle side, JetBrains works on compilation speed. There is separate special thing for hot reload in both Studio and Compose. So like there's a lot of effort to make this true. So I would be hopeful.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Go ahead,
I was going to say, I've seen a couple of efforts. We're looking at, can we do live literals and things like that? Like, are there certain changes in UI that we can detect and not have to recompile? And in that sense, the Compose team and the tools team are working super closely to try and make that happen.
And to double down on that, like the preview, and as opposed to hot reload, like the preview tools built into Studio, a really, really great way to get that fast iteration loop without having to deploy to device and so on. So that's a really great way without having to like navigate all the way to the screen you're currently working on and so forth. So you kind of can get the same effects with the tooling as well, we hope.
And to add to that as well, you can actually deploy a preview to device so you can still play with it. So that's a really great way to iterate.
Cool. I have another question from the public, which is, will custom views have their own view models?
I guess it's me, yes. So probably, at least we don't have any plans for this right now. What we want to do with view models is like to improve the story around Compose. But for custom views, you kind of can create your own stuff there, like because all bits are available, so you can have like your own view models. They're all model store owner and keep the lifecycle of your view models yourself. However, like we don't plan to add any specific on our side, at least like there's no immediate plans for that.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, what's about the art, so the Android runtime being a mainline module in Android 12? Is it true? Does it mean that we'll be getting updates right away after a new release, like iOS does? Is there anyone here that can answer that?
I can take a stab again, I probably a bit. I'm not sure how much it's available. Hopefully I won't say it's too much. But like, yeah, it's a very, there is an effort to try to make this. However, it's a very hard project and it slipped a few times. So I'm not sure, I won't guarantee that will happen. Just because like the OEMs do a lot of customization for art. Surprisingly, one of the things that they customize is localization, for example. There's OEMs that like work in specific markets and they put a lot of effort in localization and how you, it means that like AOSP should be on par with this localization or provide AOSP the powers to improve localization with this mainline effort. So it's a surprisingly complicated project. So one day it will be true. When exactly, I guess no one really knows. So what it means for EFI developers, yes, the cycle will be faster. I'm not sure like it will be like instant after upgrade. However, like yeah, it will like it will improve the things in like this department. So yeah, quicker updates of your VM, quicker security things, and so on and so on. Everything that mainline provides.
Okay, cool. Next question. Is there any available roadmap to understand when certain Jetpack libraries will move from alpha or beta to production-ready status?
I can take this one. We don't have a roadmap. That's also because, especially when we're talking about going from alpha to beta, it depends a lot on the issues that the libraries have. So it's not something that's super precise that we can say, oh, the library is going to be in alpha for, I don't know, 6 weeks or something. This is also why we're actually recommending developers to try out the libraries. This let us get a better understanding of whether indeed the library fits the needs of the developers, if there are any bugs that we might have not seen. And I think like with any other product, probably how you're working with your own apps, you decide, okay, when is it time for a new release and which bugs are a must for the next release. But what I can say in terms of like beta, usually I think a library stays in beta, I think for 2 weeks before it gets released to RC.
I can also add for expectations, like in all of Android X, when we move a library to beta, we try to make sure that the API is stable and that we're committing to that API and making minimum changes between beta and release. So a lot of that is feedback. Like if we're still getting feedback, it's going to stay in alpha until we're ready to freeze that API, because once we freeze it, we're not changing it again. So that's where like there's a lot of different factors that influence when we move through stages.
Good. As Eat once famously said, if it's in alpha, it's good for production. So next up would be, are there plans for a single flow live data? For example, a delete call that shows a pop-up of success, but every time you observe, the pop-up shows if it's not reset.
I can take this one. So it is, sorry for the long answer. It is more complicated than it sounds, because it is actually in Android a lifecycle problem. We are solving it with the infamous single life event class and also the a bit better event wrapper for live data. But that really is just something that you have to use if you know what you're doing. The problem is that in Android, there is no way to know when two observers are active, which one of them is the one that should receive the real message, like showing a snack bar. So the single life event and the event wrappers are workaround around this, but they are not the perfect solution, and that's why they are not part of a library. if you want a perfect solution, we're thinking about adding some guidance to the documentation on how to create your own managers, like a snack bar manager or a toast manager or even navigation managers. So this is something that we're really looking into because the documentation is lacking. Maybe Sergey wants to add to the lifecycle problems of live data and events.
I think I covered most of it, so I can't add much. I think if if you would replace this live data with state flow or something, you actually can run into the same problems. So it's because it's kind of, you try to solve something which is something in a bit different, in a bit wrong way, because this what it means for state of your app to have this event and so on. So because events and states are a bit different things, and this is the place when we kind of frequently mix with each other. But I can't add much.
I think just to add a little bit more to this, from the Kotlin side, if you are in an Android, in a Kotlin application, you can check out the new APIs that came with the newest coroutines library. So state flow, shed flow, and some operators, because those are going to give you the flexibility you need. So live data works in a pretty unique way, but if you need more flexibility for different requirements, you could either use the shed flow, state flow, or even using a channel for having that blocking queue behavior that you might need. So check out the different possibilities, learn the APIs, because they are going to help you with the requirements that you might have.
Good. I would go back to Compose because there's a couple of questions that I think are closely related and maybe can be tackled at the same time. The first one is, what do you think are the main differences between Jetpack Compose and Flutter? And the second one is, what are the advantages in Compose to use composable functions instead of objects like Flutter widgets? Anyone with this?
I can take a stab at that. So I'm not going to do a direct comparison of Compose and Flutter. I think you should look at them and decide the strengths. We're mostly here from the Compose side, and I'll speak to the strengths of Compose. And if you look at the strengths of Flutter, I think you should kind of make your own evaluation of which technology suits your use case, really. But for us, the Android team is building Compose as our solution for building Android UI. So we want to make it the best way to build Android UIs, and as such, we're going to provide tight integration with the Android platform, integration with architecture components and your existing Zap architecture. We love Kotlin. It's built on top of Kotlin and heavily utilizes language features and getting more and more integrations with coroutines and so forth. And also it's tightly integrated with the Android tooling story as well. So built hand in hand with Android Studio to work with your existing flows and tools and processes that you know and love. So I think I'd summarize those as kind of the main strengths that Compose brings to you, as well as they share the benefits of declarative UI being faster, a more kind of effective way to build your UIs. So I'd say look at those strengths, and if they kind of make sense to you, then that's where I'd say that Compose is better in ways. Anybody want to add anything else to that?
I can add. I'd say, as Nick said, it's the Android team building Compose. We're very focused on Android developers. We're trying to make this easy. We're very focused on interop, for example. We're very focused on just getting things quick and ready for our developers. It's interesting, the question around objects versus methods. I wish Leland were here because he's the source of truth. But in general, there is already a huge difference in that when you do declarative with an object model, you're allocating a bunch of objects every time you're doing a composition. That we're saving that by doing it through methods. So we memorize where the method calls were, and we're avoiding a bunch of memory allocation just out of doing the memory path. And that's just one of the differences. I'm pretty sure there's a bunch of compiler differences as well, and just optimizations that Leland would be the source of truth here, and he's not here today.
It's kind of one question is because it's not objects, functions create this at least look of it's being stateless, so your composable functions don't have much state, or they have state sometimes, but most of them they call an hour function and so on, so kind of side effects free, which is not completely true, but it's kind of a closer look to this, so it's a bit nicer model from this perspective.
Okay, before I ask the next question, I'm going to answer one because I think I'm the only person in this group that can do it. There's someone asking if there's any content in Italian, and the answer is I'm the only person that speaks Italian here, and I'm the one asking the questions. So no, I'm afraid not. And I'm going to repeat it briefly in Italian, so sorry. Non c'è contenuto in italiano perché sono l'unico che parla italiano e gli altri sono quelli che rispondono, quindi mi dispiace. No. Okay, next up, and going back to the actual answers that you're here for. Is there any chance that Google will be writing down consistent guidelines for Android development? Because having a view model class is not enough.
I can take this one. Guidelines for Android development is very wide, but based on the question, I assume that this is about architecture and building an Android app. If this is not the case, reach out to us on Twitter and let us know what you mean. But if architecture is the topic, then we actually say a little bit more. We have a guide to app architecture on developer.android.com. But I have to admit that indeed, even that guidance is maybe a bit too vague, let's say, and hasn't been updated with the latest guidance. But we are planning on working on this. So stay tuned in the next few months. Hopefully, you'll also see some updates on the guide to app architecture.
By the way, just for the people that aren't very comfortable with asking questions in English, do ask them in Italian. I can translate the questions, but I cannot translate the answers. Or someone can reply in Spanish, apparently. So next up would be, are there any plans on updating the material.io documentation to include compose examples as well?
I can take this one. The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is that, as you may or may not know, material is built into Compose. So it's a first-class citizen using Compose material. And also that developer.android.com will always be the home of, I think, Compose's main documentation. But given that close relationship and that material team and Android team work so closely together, we're actively considering how we can highlight Compose on material.io and that we have that graceful overlap going on so that you get the best of both. So definitely, we are actively looking at this right now.
Okay, thank you. Will the app Compat packages be gone at any time soon now that Android X is quite established? Chris?
It's because I have multiple windows. I don't know. Yeah, I can take this. So the goal of App Compat is actually to not exist. But the problem is because we keep making changes to the platform, and App Compat's goal is to obviously give you a stable API that works across all different API levels. And obviously, because the platform changes, we've got to keep making those changes to App Compat, which means it's always changing. And so App Compat will exist for as long as the platform keeps changing. I mean, it's the short answer to that. As Compose gets towards stable and that becomes the UI toolkit of choice, App Compat's role probably is less. And so there may become a point where App Compat becomes deprecated or removed, but we're not at that point yet, and it's going to be a few years until that time.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So next up, we have a question I'm not sure anyone here can actually provide a good answer for, but let's try. AndroidX.media2 will be stable 1.10 next week, but it's still not actively recommended. Should we still be using it, the media session Compat APIs instead of it? If there's nobody here, it's fine to say no.
Yeah, there's no one here. If Don was here, he could answer, but he's not.
Okay, so let's go back to Compose for a second. What is the reasoning behind transitioning away from XML files? Even if the API is nicer, it still feels like a bit going back to Java Swing. This is from a Compose fan. And I can attest that Swing is not fun.
Nick, do you want to start? I was going to say one of the big ones when we started, we were looking at things like dynamic theming and just like runtime decisions. I think apps have evolved a lot since we first wrote the initial toolkit. And there's a lot of things we want to do that just XML is limiting us. And because it's pre-written, it's pre-compiled, it forces us to, it locks us up into a corner. And then we understand there's a lot of power. For example, I said like string resources and internationalization, there's a lot of power in it. But we're trying to add more flexibility. And I know Chris has been doing a bunch of like dynamic theming feature requests that we just couldn't honor in the old system that are becoming much, much easier by moving away.
Yeah, to build on that, a lot of people are kind of like say that they like the separation of concerns of, you know, the layout is in XML and then code is in code, but it was kind of not really true, because like you always end up having to look up views by ID and then poke at them and change stuff. And especially like as apps become more dynamic and, you know, reacting to streams of events and so on, it's just becomes almost like a false promise that you can separate out the two. You have things like data binding, trying to bridge those worlds, trying to bring dynamicism into your kind of like static layouts. But in a way, it's kind of not really possible. It's better to kind of embrace the fact that your UI is kind of a transformation of those states, and not trying to tie your hands and trying to do it in a static language which can't handle this dynamism. Actually, is just a much better way to go, we found, and makes is a better solution to this problem. It's the right abstraction level. So we just think it's a better way to go.
Another interesting bit to this is that the fact that XML is separate to your code means that minification tools have a hard time trying to minify your app. So if you have a look at your typical APK minified via IR8 or ProGuard, whichever, you'll see that in your app, there's all view classes are kept. And that's because your layouts have this string, which is the full class name to your view. And there's no way for the minification tool to know whether that view is used or not. So the default ProGuard is that it just keeps all view classes. Now, if you look at app compat, material, all of them, you're looking at about 1 megabyte in your APK you're dragging around, which you may not even be using. It's just what happens. Whereas if we compose, because it's all just code, R8, ProGuard have a much better time being able to minify your app. So,
okay. Next up, when will the material library provide all the components listed in the documentation, such as sheets, side, or permanent search?
I think that's me again. Yeah, so first of all, I'll say that the material components library team, so that's the Vue implementation of material, does actively work to add new components to each stable release. So you'll notice things like in 1.2, we had sliders, progress indicators, and time pickers are currently being worked on. It takes a long time for one of those components to go through its full, almost like stable, it's a full view, it's a full widget that needs testing, it needs an alpha, beta, release candidate, release cycle. So it is always going to be kind of slow, and they do add and consider new components for each release. Second thing I'll add is that there are certain times when some components are just not really released in the library because we see them slightly more as patterns that can be fairly easily implemented with basic views and layouts and more lower level components, and they don't necessarily need to be shipped as full standalone components. That can sometimes be opinionated, so if you do really have a need for one, I would advise raising an issue on the GitHub repository. The last thing I'll add is that especially for something like search as an example of this like slightly strange overlap that you get between the material library and something like app compat or perhaps another Android X library, where should it live in material? Is it actually listed on material.io? And there's sometimes a bit of a gray area that exists that can be tricky for that team to work with, because really their goal is to like implement what you see on material.io, and if material.io doesn't necessarily actively document what search should look like in your app, then you're probably not going to get in that library. So it's something we're thinking about, and something we're also thinking about, I think, for Compose, which implements material. So yeah, but again, I would say, please reach out to me or make an issue on the GitHub repository and we'll take a look at it.
I can add the same for Compose. When we started Compose, we knew we wanted to do material out of the box, but it is a huge endeavor to implement everything that's in the material.io site. So we try to be smart in prioritizing what we built, and we worked with Devrel here, so everyone in this call, trying to build like sample apps, trying to figure out what were the most common components. We talked to Nick and his team, like what was the most used parts of MDC, and we've tried to prioritize those in Compose, and we think we have a pretty good set right now where you can build most apps that you want to build. If there are things that you're really, really keen on that we haven't built, please let us know. We hope we've given enough building blocks that you can actually do the things that are missing on your own. And over time, we'll try and continue to fill that gap.
Okay, cool. Someone asked, what is Jetpack? So maybe we should take a step back for a second and explain that to those that aren't aware.
I can protect this. So what is Jetpack? So Jetpack is a collection of libraries which help developers build modern apps. So you might have seen the Modern Android initiative that Chet has been bringing about, and that the whole team has been using the mad skills. There was one last week on navigation, then we had one on bundles the week before, and there's more lined up over the next couple of weeks, next months even. But basically, we're trying to be more opinionated about how to actually write apps on Android. And so the mad skills falls into that, and Jetpack is the way you do that. So it's the libraries that you use underneath to try and make your modern apps.
Thank you very much. Next up, speaking of another library, is what are the advantages, the benefits of using the activity results API?
Yeah, I can take this one. So usually when you're working with the activity and you have to implement your own activity result, you have to check which request code the specific result is referring to, then verify that the result is okay. So it's quite a lot of complicated code that you need to write. But with the activity results API, we're providing type-safe contracts. So these contracts kind of create a specific input and result types for common actions.
Yeah, I'll add one small thing on top of that. So like over the last few years, there was like the whole effort like to move away from asking developers to override some methods, like whether it's like on start, on resume, on create, and so on with life cycles, or like Vue modules provides a pluggable way to have this like different retained state that is retained across configurations. So this is another thing that we add into this layer. So like now your component can add these activity result handlers without overriding any specific methods on the fragment itself. So like basically you may have your fragment or your component activity or like any subclasses of it. And then your component receives this thing and like it adds some handler without like asking developers to like actually override this method and call into my component or something like that. So this way help us to build the more self-contained components that you can just drop into your fragment or activity and the whole thing is done. So like, we try to cover like most of the use cases that like in this area.
Thank you. I think we should talk a bit about dependency injection because I see a couple of questions there. One of them is, when will Hilt be stable? For new projects, would you recommend to start with it instead of using the normal Dagger 2? And also, if you don't mind to also answer this other question, what do you think about Coin and can you compare it to Hilt and Dagger 2?
Sure. Okay. The second one is going to be challenging and very controversial. But anyway, the first one is that so it will likely be in 2021 because 2020 is almost over. So Hilt probably will reach stable. Like when we released Hilt in June, it was like probably like 6 months ago or so. We wanted to make a couple of improvements before it hits stable. And the one that is remaining is the Hilt supporting assisted injection. So for like having dependency injection for these runtime parameters that cannot be known at compile time. So that's still in development. So that's why we haven't move to stable. But we've seen Hilt used in production quite a bit now. So apart from the internal Google apps that use Hilt, we also seen a lot of open source exposure notifications applications that have been using Hilt in production. And so like they are working fine. So it's mainly up to you if you want to use Hilt or not in production. So yeah, it will come soon, I guess. So we wanted to make some breaking changes in alpha, and we already made them. So you shouldn't expect that many changes from now on. So for example, we renamed application component to singleton component, but that's already there. If you use the latest version of Hilt, you will see those changes. And then regarding Coin, yeah, it's another alternative. So the problem, the main difference between Coin and Hilt is what happens under the hood. So even though they follow dependency injection best practices, internally Coin works as a service locator pattern where the dependencies are in a map. And so that kind of has a cost at runtime. So whenever you ask for a dependency, it has to check out for that class in the map of dependencies and then grab it at runtime, and that's costly. Versus Hilt or Dagger that does all that job at compile time, and so at runtime it is faster. That means that because Coin has more flexibility at runtime, it's actually probably better in some scenarios. For example, if you have a project where you might get unknown dependencies from anywhere, like for example, I'm thinking in dynamic feature modules where like modules could appear or disappear from your app. Coin gives you the flexibility that Hilt doesn't give you, but at the cost of having, for example, if a dependency is not available, it will crash at runtime versus Hilt that will give you an error at compile time. So there are pros and cons before choosing what to use, like read the documentation, see what is the best benefit or the best tool for your application. And from then now on, then you decide. Obviously, we recommend the Dagger and Hilt because that's the product we built. But obviously, like you are free to decide what to use in your apps.
Thank you, Manuel. And if you don't mind, I have a follow-up for you, which is, will Hilt have fragment constructor injection with Fragment Factory out of the box?
There were a couple of, the team has considered it, but there were a couple of problems that haven't been solved at the moment. So this is an open question that we have. There are a few things like, for example, if you have a fragment factory, then you don't have the fragment as a binding in the fragment component. And so there are a couple of trade-offs that we have to consider. But yeah, like the team has that in mind and probably will have something to say about it, like publicly. And for sure, no, this is just something that we keep in mind. There is nothing for sure at the moment.
Thank you. Next up, when will a simple request system permission in one-touch library be provided? I know this is the kind of questions you folks hate, but go for it.
Well, I can say something probably. So there is activity, like we already mentioned that, like there is activity result like part of a library of component activity. Android.activity, I think it's a library. So yeah, that thing actually helps you to request permissions as well, so you can use that. However, in general, there is like, it can be just like super simple for one small reason of like, once you request a permission, and our activity starts, so your application can die as a result on the low like tier phones, because like it's some settings things like came up and something. So like your users need come back with the results from your like permissions results, like, oh, you actually received the permission to do something with restarted app from scratch. So this adds the whole like layer of complexity of like just how Android built and so on, just because like it's another thing that starts. But yeah, look at this Android.activity result. That thing may help you and may solve your thing that you want to do. It's a bit easier and nicer than plain permissions thing.
Okay. So there's a question that I'm not 100% sure what it means, but I think it's about lifecycle. is there any possibility to have callbacks about foreground and background, or are you planning any new Jetpack APIs to get those? If anyone has any...
That's the main communication with work manager jobs, for example, from your app, because that is a thing for sure.
I think we have some API Jetpack libraries that use, for example, the task, which is kind of a feature in Java. So that uses callbacks. For example, the Firebase APIs use that. But it's been weird because we've been trying to simplify callbacks with coroutines. It seems like now people want to get the code more complicated using callbacks now. I would try, callbacks have some downsides. Like, for example, errors are more difficult to propagate. Nesting, it's more unreadable. And so try to simplify your code, for example, using coroutines. That it's what we've been trying to recommend. And so, callbacks has some pros and cons, probably more cons than pros, but yeah, I would use coroutines instead.
So for foreground thing and lifecycle, I think there is a package process lifecycle owner. This is the closest that we have, and unfortunately we cannot really get anything closer because even the system itself doesn't really know if you're going to background or not. Interestingly, so one quick story. You basically once you're taking the screen, your system server doesn't know if you're going to your activity going to appear or something else will happen in meanwhile while there's an animation going, because phone call may happen and something else completely appears. So your application goes to background very quickly. So it's very messy topic. We have this process of secondary, but unfortunately we can't give anything better than that.
Thank you. The next question is, what are the main differences between JetBrains Compose, or as it's actually called, Compose for Desktop, and Jetpack Compose?
I can get started and then probably hand it over to Sergey. We've been working with JetBrains for a while. We have built Compose in a way that we don't depend on Android to be able to enable them to do things like Compose for Desktop. They've been working on this on their own, but it's been a close collaboration where we're helping them figure out how to use Compose for this. Sergey has the more technical details, I think.
Yeah, I think I will just add that we will obviously add some components that make sense on the desktop rather than on the phones, and more desktop focused because it's a very different interaction. It's keyboard heavy, mouse and so on. So they will focus on this part. But there's no technologically, there is no difference. The technology is the same. However, there is different components that are targeted to be different use cases. I don't know, maybe I'll say something so much again, but why we build this is because the Swing is almost deprecated or officially deprecated. However, IntelliJ is built on Swing, so this is public knowledge. So we are looking into something what we can do instead going forward. This is very important effort for them. This is why it happens.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers well enough. And we have another question here, which is instead still Kotlin, but what will be the future of Kotlinx synthetics? Now, before we answer this, I just want to point out that they have been deprecated in Kotlin 1.2.20 that was out this week. And I guess that's the reason why this question was asked. So what are the alternatives?
It's very simple. In Android, the alternative is going to be view binding for quick replacement of synthetics. If you want to do a better binding with data, then you can obviously use data binding. And if you're moving to Compose, you don't have to worry about these things.
Yeah, just want to clear with this deprecation, there should be a post or blog or something on developerandroid.com that answers the questions around the synthetics and its deprecation. It should be already there. If it's not there, it will be there soon. The definitely was prepared, at least for this deprecation, so please take a look there.
There's also a follow-up, is data binding dead?
No, and actually Manu can explain why?
Yeah, it is not that. It is true that the focus has been to put in those efforts in Compose, because that's what the future is going to be. And so data binding is still there. It works. It's going to be maintained, but don't expect like huge improvements in data binding, because as I was saying, like the efforts have been moved to Compose. It is true that we, as I was talking before, like we are going to add support for Stateflow. And those like some tiny things that we want to make things better. And for example, like bringing, coroutines and flow up to, for example, as I was saying, like live data or on the behaviors and functionality you can achieve with it. But yeah, data binding is there. Use it if it fits your needs. And that's it.
Cool. Thank you. Preview window for current view system reacts much faster to UI changes compared to Compose in Android Studio, I guess is the context here. Are you confident that this will change in the near future?
I can take this. So the preview window we built for Studio for Compose is a completely new tool. It is meant to work very closely with Compose. We are working very closely with them. There's interesting things it can do that the view system preview, which I assume is the view editor, the preview, we built an interactive preview. So because we are actually analyzing your Compose code and compiling that and rendering that as the preview, we can do things like you can click on buttons and see the ripples, which you weren't able to do in the view system one. So there are different stacks that we're building on. As we said before, we are working on optimizing that as much as we can, and we expect it to improve a lot more before 1.0.
Cool. I would move to a bunch of questions about navigation. The first one is, how can we reuse a fragment in different navigation graphs?
I guess I'll build default fallback. So please don't. I think the answer is don't try to do this. I mean, like, as far as I understand the question, if you want to have the same instance, and you want to reuse it somehow like twice and with different nodes in one graph, like it's kind of like you won't save it much if you try to, like, if you think it's some kind of a memory saving thing. If your fragment is so heavy that it's actually some saving, then you probably should split it somehow, and then your fragment instances should be recreated and should be different in the different parts of the stack, if I understand the question correctly.
And follow up to that is, would you provide in the future a guide or a feature on top of navigation to obtain multiple fragment stacks with a bottom navigation view like the YouTube app does?
Yeah, I was going to say the guidance is already there. The advanced navigation sample is showcasing exactly this, but it is a workaround until there is official support, which is coming in the next major release of navigation. Unfortunately, I don't think we have dates for that, but it should be very close.
Okay.
The reason why it took so long was that they had to revamp the whole fragment system, so it hasn't been easy at all.
Okay. So it is 1, so we have time for just the last question, which is a very off-topic one. What is the path to become a GDG member?
So I don't mind taking this one. I used to be a GDG organizer. Quite simple, actually. You need to go to developers.google.com/community/GDG. And there you can do one of two things. You can find a GDG chapter near you, and the chances are there's almost definitely going to be one in your city because there's a lot of them. Alternatively, you can actually apply to create a new GDG chapter. It's a win-win. You can either find an existing meetup community in your city or in your area, or you can go ahead and start your own one. So that's it.
Okay, I think that's it for today. Thank you, everyone. And thank you also to all the panelists.